Grabe, beware the jabbermock, my son, the jaws that bite, the claws that snatch. Beware the jubjubber. Join in with me if you know this thing. And the fruminous, and shun the fruminous bandersnatch. All right. So welcome, Zoomers. We're glad to have you here. We're going to do our second history session today. We're fortunate in having two history enthusiasts who are going to present for us, Adele Hansen and Mickey Morissette, taking different highlights of this period of the Dietrich years. They're going to be presenting for about, what are we doing, 45 minutes, and then we open it to questions and comments. And we'd love your thoughts then. I think that covers the key points. It was a very eventful period, this period from 1916 to 1935. If you remember that, we've got a lot of things happening. Do you know there's still child labor in this country until the 1930s? Did you know that? These people were really fighting against bad stuff. Okay, I turn it over to Adele.
All right. When last we met, this was last month, you heard a little bit about Henry Simmons, who had these wonderful oratorical skills. He drew more members into the society. Well, who led this congregation? What about the governance system? Well, the governance structure was 5 men. And 2 of them, Samuel Gale, you know, the Gale Mansion that's over on blah, blah, and Orlando Merriman, they alternated chairing the board, and mostly they dealt with finance. Well, as I asked earlier today, what were the women up to? Well, at first there were 2 groups. There was the Women's Club and the Ladies' Aid Society. So you can envision what they might have been doing. Women's Club, much more, talking about the domestic issues of the cooking and gardening and things like that. And the Ladies' Aid, of course, being a little bit more service-oriented. And most of their work provided additional support for the congregation. They had a new building that Simmons had and others had purchased. And so they furnished the new building. And they created a kitchen, which all of us are very happy that started back then. They gave luncheons to support the operating fund. And they actually contributed 1/10 of the minister's salary. Well, it must have been really good luncheons. Think about what you paid for your mini meal. In 1896, they created an RE program for children. And they formed a greeting community or a committee to welcome our visitors. And they also sent copies of Simmons' sermons to interested parties in the Midwest and Canada. So the women were a little bit more than support. They were actually doers. I'd like to give you a little bit of information about someone who I had never heard of. I think most people in Minnesota perhaps have a little blank about this woman. And her name was Maud Conkey Stockwell. Well, she was this incredible woman, incredible. And she worked for suffrage and other social justice issues throughout her very long life. She was born in Milwaukee in 1863, but her family moved to Hennepin County. Now, I don't know what Hennepin County was like back then, but I have this vision of most roads were dirt roads, not maybe paved. There were trees, there were beautiful flowers and everything. And what was it like to live then? Well, the reality was, where was the woman's place? It was in the home. And Maud graduated, she went to school, and she, in fact, was a classmate of Clara Ulin. And she graduated from high school. She wanted to go to college, but they didn't have the money in the family. Plus, there weren't a lot of women in college at that point. So what did she do? Well, what do you do with as a woman who is an educated woman? She became a teacher. right? Because that was an acceptable profession. She began she had a lot of energy, and she was in a lot of women's clubs. But there, again, their agendas were mostly focused on subjects of art, literature, religion, discussion. But gradually, over the time, their attention was given to more of the civic and social problems of the day. In 1876, Minnesota women were given some voting rights. They were allowed to vote for library board members. Think of that. Who was on the library board today that we know are their names? I don't know. Okay, somebody knows. About 20 minutes later, they were given a little bit more privilege. They could vote for school officials. So school officials and library board members, but not the rest of it. Well, in 1887, Maud married someone named Sylvanus Stockwell, and he was really an incredible person of his own. He subsequently was elected to the Minnesota legislature, and he was very liberal, very, very liberal, thought that everyone should have equal rights. And he wanted to extend suffrage. So after they were married, she became much more politically aware of what was going on, especially in issues concerning the living and working conditions of women and children. In 1891, Sylvanus introduced a bill designed to give municipal suffrage to women. I have no idea what that means. I am assuming it means they could vote in the city elections. Well, that bill was defeated. The Stockwells then started working as a team, fighting for women's rights. The prevailing opinion was that women were intellectually unfit to vote, and that women would lose their charm and then be dragged down to the level of men, and the family would just be broken up. In reality, it was the men who didn't want to get up the power, right? We know that. The Minnesota Women's Suffrage Association was organized in 1881, and in 1900, so 20 years later, Maud Stockwell, who was representing the 12th ward of that organization, was elected its president. And she served in that role for about 10 years. And she spoke up about a variety of equal rights issues. And as Wendy reminded you, kids were still working. Child labor was important. And in 1902, Sylvanus introduced a bill to grant women co-guardianship of their minor children. That was initially voted down, but it finally passed in 1904. In 1905, the Suffrage Association pushed for enactment of the Juvenile Court Bill. Well, suffrage was getting to be a hotter topic. And in January 1905, Maud led a delegation of 25 women with a petition to meet with the newly elected Governor John A. Johnson. And Johnson had put into his platform that he was a supporter of suffrage. So they asked if in his inaugural speech to the legislature, he say something about suffrage. He did not. Nevertheless, what is it? She persisted. They persisted. The Stockwells were a team. And Stockwell continued traveling throughout the state. She encouraged educators to get involved and start student clubs. The Suffrage Association fought to repeal laws giving a wife's earnings to her husband. They fought for the right for women to go to college. She fought for equal pay for women And especially there was one place, they were allowed to vote for the librarians. And there'd been a librarian who had been newly appointed, and they gave her the salary of $1,000, which sounds really incredible at that time, except that her predecessor, whose name was Hosmer, had a salary of $2,000. Well, that was the way things were. During that time, she was very active in First Unitarians, and she became the first woman appointed to the board. She taught in the RE program. She and her husband welcomed members to something called the Corn Fests. And that was at the Stockwell Farm. Now, if you think about it, they were eating corn. It was probably late in summer, early fall. And people would come, and they were after lunch, and people said, it was the most delicious corn we've ever had. But after lunch, there'd be a speaker and then a discussion. And Maud Ann Sylvanus shared in those coasting duties. In 1910, she has to be relieved from her position because she was raising a family, two daughters. And she remained very active fighting for equality. On May 2nd, 1914, she and her two daughters joined a parade that was going to go through. The Suffrage Association had organized it, going down Nicollet Avenue, sorry. And they worked in a brigade with the women, but there were also men that walked. And Sylvanus was one of them that walked. 2,000 people showed up for this parade, which, if you think about it at the time, must have been a lot of people. The women came from every walk of life and every age, walked with dignity. They put on their hats. I didn't have a picture that wasn't black and white. Everything was black and white in those pictures. So as the Minneapolis Tribune commented, the city learned that those who ask for the ballot are not, quote, a bevy of hopeless spinsters, unhappily married women, or persons who had nothing else to do. Yeah, unquote. Across the country, attitudes about suffrage were changing, especially in the West, right? Women were much more active about suffrage. And both the Democratic and Republican platforms, party platforms, national platforms, placed a suffrage plank on their platforms. And from then on, the suffragists just focused on making the parties fulfill that pledge. So on June 19th, the 19th Amendment forbidding the denial of vote on account of sex was submitted to the states for ratification. In a special session of the Minnesota legislature on September 8th, 1919, both the House and the Senate, by nearly unanimous vote, ratified that amendment. And that evening, the ladies of the Twin Cities, including Clara and Madge, invited the legislators for an old-fashioned chicken dinner. Well, you would think that Maud Stockwell would take a breath and relax. She's been doing this for 10 years, more than 10 years, right? But that's not true. So she just found a new cause, and she continued to fight for peace. Now, this is 1919, so think about what was going on in the world. We had just had the First World War, or the World War to end all wars, right? And she became the first state president of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And it was a position she held for 11 years. And she advocated for disarmament. She gave speeches promoting the establishment of the League of Nations and the World Court. And for this advocacy, she was derided as a communist. Not surprising, right? Her peace work also focused on local issues. She fought to make compulsory military drill optional at the U of M. Now, before that, U of M is a land-grant university. And some people said, no, you can't do that. We have to have all of the men in the university have to have a compulsory military drill 3 times a week. And she argued that such training perpetuates the idea of war. She never relaxed, and she seemed to have boundless energy. While being interviewed for a news article, she looked back at her long advocacy of success with the suffrage movement and saying, well, you know, after we won the right to vote, I was entertaining some friends, social people, and the postman left a notice for jury duty, and they began to sympathize with me. Oh, get out of it. You can get out of it easily. You know, you've done things. And I said, get out of it. I've been fighting for this opportunity for 25 years. She lived until 1958, so she was an incredible worker. And all that time, just working on social issues, helping make society better. And she was a true fighter for justice.
Thank you, Adele. I'm going to talk a little bit about Clara Jullan, partly because I had an uncorrected proof of her book at our Minnesota Women's Press, and she was fascinating. She was at First Unitarian Society once upon a time. She did leave, which I'll talk about, but she was, yes, as Adele mentioned, she was she was a friend with Maud. They went to school together, and I'm missing one of my pages. I don't know, maybe. So there was in 1901 a gathering in Minneapolis of the suffrage leaders, women's suffrage leaders in 1901. They had not had a lot to celebrate in the 53 years since Seneca Falls. Things had gotten kind of stagnated. Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and Idaho did allow full voting rights for women. And as Adele said, women in Minnesota could vote in school and library elections, but that was about it. Congress didn't even talk about the issue from 1894 until 1913. In Minnesota, and part of what came out of this 1901 gathering, a new group of suffragists showed up, and they really were not just cooking chicken dinners. They became very effective lobbyists. They got very skilled at public relations, and they became very enthusiastic fundraisers. One of them that came up here in 1901 from Kentucky, Laura Clay, said, "We've learned that the apathy of women to their own political freedom is as great an obstacle to our success as the unwillingness of men to grant our claims. It is of the same importance to us to educate women out of their indifference as it is to educate men out of their unwillingness." So I'm going to talk a little bit about Clara, and then I'm going to lead it back into John Dietrich, who was ahead of his time as a man who believed in birth control, believed in women's rights to vote, and kind of where he was leading First Unitarian. One of the things that I found great when I was reading this bio of Clara Jullan was that they weren't just focused on the Twin Cities. They had groups starting in 1883 that were forming women in other places, local societies. They had in Excelsior, Farmington, Jordan, Lake City, Red Wing, Rochester, Shakopee, and Wayzata. They also had small committees formed in Anoka, Brooklyn Center, Champlin, Long Prairie, and Wabasha. But it would wane, again, unless there was a visitor from somebody who was speaking. And then eventually they got better at communications with each other through a temperance newsletter that was growing up in the early 1900s. So it would wane. And then it took people like Maud Stockwell and Clara Jullan to really take the bull by the horns. One thing I want to just mention about Clara Clara's past that I thought was amazing. She was very poor growing up. Her father had died young. Her mother had moved to Minnesota to be near sisters. They lived above a hardware store in Minneapolis eventually. And as a young woman, she refused other invitations to the junior ball and went with the only African American boy in the school. So, and then she met Andreas Jullan. She was about 15 at the time. They'd met at a church function somewhere. He had moved here from Norway as a young man, had come straight to Minnesota because he'd met a farmer from Minnesota in Norway. So he decided Minnesota was the promised land. He eventually was in Farmington, and then he walked his way to Minneapolis. He spent $3 for a book called 100 Lessons in English. He worked on constructing the city's first sewer, and then he studied law. And he reacted against the fact that there was still a very gloomy Lutheran orthodoxy in religion here, that talked a lot about fear. And he became part of a group that was much more focused on creating anew, because of the freedom that we had. And they learned about socialism. They talked about feminism. He attended a bunch of different churches, and then he started coming to meetings here with the Liberal League. And Clara's, he wasn't her husband yet, but he said that which is of most value and a contribution to the culture of the world must be evolved from our own lives and surroundings, not just living on the past or what is borrowed, because that's where stagnation comes from. He was also a big reader of Ibsen, who was talking about women's rights to self-fulfillment. And so together, he and Clara raised kids without gender roles. The book notes boys made their own beds. They had 7 kids, and the girls were playing sports. They enabled them to be adventurous. The girls went to college. One wanted to be a lawyer or an engineer. And Clara was part of the early days of trying to get free kindergartens. She believed that mothers needed to be really engaged in order for their children to grow up to be the best that they can be. So yes, then they were at First Unitarian Society, which had been around since 1881. Her husband, Andreas, really liked Henry Simmons for being probably better informed on science generally than anybody else in the Northwest, and that he had unbounded toleration for every kind of sincere religious belief. Simmons was voted in 1888 as the most popular minister in the city. And then Simmons often joined the Jullan family for Sunday dinners. And then Clara described an annual meeting of the First Unitarian Society saying, Unitarians are cheerful sinners and enjoy their own shortcomings and being scolded. Said the music in our church is always the cause of great merriment. So that's been around. And then her daughter, Brenda Jullan, recalled her mother being very pleased when her younger brother asked, is God a bird? So after Simmons died, about 5 years after he died, the Jullans left First Unitarian because they were not very fond of this humanism thing. It hadn't completely taken root, so I'm not quite sure what was happening before Dietrich officially got here, but they left. And Clara said, I think I no longer belong there because it's dominated by people who seem to me unsound in views. And I know, yes, there were a lot of different arguments going on, as Adele alluded to. They ended up moving over to Plymouth Congregational Church. They also had heated arguments with friends who stayed here. And as Adele mentioned, the Women's Club was forming at that time. Clara was involved in campaigns for clean streets, clean water, clean air, getting decent lodging houses for working women. She was part of the protective legislation against abuse of women and reducing the work week to 58 hours for working women. That was the reduction, was to 58 hours. But she left the women's club because people there were not uniformly endorsing the idea of suffrage. People, she said, on the board seemed to be in favor of women's right to vote, but they were afraid of offending other people. So they did not allow people to be leading the board who were in favor of women's votes. So Clara decided that was not for her, and she didn't stay involved after that. Instead, she started doing fundraising suffrage garden parties with speeches, dances, and skits. And it was not until 1913 when she became firmly committed to the suffrage leadership that she was part of. She had 40 women come to her home to organize a different kind of suffrage club, including the press. And her message was that the best thing the nation can do is raise a better set of children. So she wanted to also appeal to a better sense of sisterhood among women because she saw that that wasn't always the case. She had to be kind of nursed into the idea that women being really assertive about their rights was actually okay. She didn't like meek and mild, but she also thought some of the tactics that were being used were a little too much. But she eventually realized that was necessary. She did believe that the suffrage movement needed to be open to both the men and women. She started organizing the wards and the districts in Hennepin County, created a press committee, education, a junior committee to recruit young people, membership and leadership committees. And she said, you can't have too many clubs. The more clubs there are, the more voters we reach. And the book indicates that, yes, after Maud Stockwell had stepped down, things really kind of waned. And so Clara was the one that kind of stepped in. She was in charge of the parade committee that had the parade on May 2nd, 1914. She said some people thought it was unladylike for women to march. But she reminded them that it had also been considered to eat healthy foods and to be healthy and to go to school and to college. And yes, it drew 1,972 marchers, men, high school students, small children. And then they also hosted a debate that included a woman that was pro and a woman that was anti-suffrage. And the debate was less focused on what God wanted. It was, again, this idea, Florence Carpenter was the one that voiced it, that the home is the core of it all, as it is the core of civilization. The woman works for the home, the man works for the home outside, and that political responsibilities would impose additional burdens. There was also fears, certainly at the time, that if women were allowed to vote, that would include immigrant women, people that were less educated, less native, more illiterate, and that these would be corrupt women who should not be allowed to vote. So there was that push. Countering her was a woman named Josephine Shane, who said women need to have a hand in preparing the world for the children. Anne said, most of us can trace our ancestry back to those who fled to this country. In fact, Minnesota was a little less offensive than other states in not caring where you came from to vote, because in the 1905 census, almost all people had a parent who had come here from another country. We still had a lot of immigrants at the turn of the century. Josephine Shane also said that the most valuable voter is the one who knows most about social misery. She had herself lived in the Pillsbury settlement house for 2 years. She said the best community will be the place where the men and women can work together in the solution of the problems of government. And then I like this quote from Clara, who said, the hardest lesson in this 1,000 years, and one not completely learned yet, is that it's not safe to leave government in the hands of one man or a group of men, and that one class cannot judge wisely or decide fairly for the whole. So that was definitely her message. And she said it would, being able to let women vote was also going to be give us more attention to housing, to pure food laws, clean streets, disposal of garbage, sanitary conditions in the workplace, and that better food and safer shelters and more education was what children needed to have an abundant life. And that this intensive concern for home life should be expressed in the government. So smart. And let's see. And then, as Adele mentioned, then everything for women voters, Minnesota's white women voters, was ratified in September of 1919. And then the National League of Women Voters came about after that, said, whereas millions of women will become voters in 1920, and whereas the low standards of citizenship found among men clearly indicated the need of education and the principles and ideals of our government and methods of political procedures, therefore be it resolved that the National League of Women Voters be urged to make political education of the new voters, not excluding men, its first duty in 1920. So that's a little bit about what the women were doing. And then, yes, Dietrich came to us in 1916. He'd already had some things that got him in trouble elsewhere for things that he believed. I'm going to mention this real quick. I could not remember which talk this came from. I didn't have it dated, but my guess is it was around, he went to Germany in 1933. He gave a lot of talks around that time about fascism. So I want to just drop in a few things that he said at a talk, which I guess is probably from the early 1930s. He said, there are those who think that the chief dangers are the plots of the communists and the pacifists and the internationalists. But the efforts of these groups are trivial as compared with the subtle menace involved in the ignorance, intolerance, and indifference of the great mass of American people. They are fit material for exploitation by the political demagogue who is just around the corner. They are flattered into believing they are free, while they are all the time being made slaves to passion and ignorance. Not having risen above the level of response to emotional urge, they fall for the slogans of any political rascal. And when our liberties disappear, it will not be the result of radical agitation, but rather because the millions of our countrymen have not yet grasped the basic principles of responsibility, tolerance, and courage. They have not developed within themselves spiritual values which alone can preserve a democracy in times like these from the worst form of tyranny, the tyranny of the rod which falls victim to the demagogue. That is exactly what happened in Italy and in Germany. So that was Dietrich. I will mention a couple other things that Dietrich said, and then we can open up to any questions, because, yeah, I looked at all of his talks and picked out some great quotes that I love, and I gave some of them in a talk I gave here in 2018. But I appreciate how much he was ahead of his time, not in everything, but he did talk about labor rights, the myth of the superior race, classism in America, and the merits of atheism. Yes, he came back and reported on, he was worried about the impact that Hitler was making in German minds. In the 1920s, he suggested that birth control be given to every married couple and that divorce be accepted as an entirely respectable procedure. In around 1917, it's not dated, but it was one of his first talks here before women had the right to vote. And he said, the trouble with our government is that it's a government of men, by men, and for men, with the result that it is not so much human as masculine. What is our country without the influence of women stamped upon it? He believed in euthanasia for the terminally ill. He was not a big fan of capitalism. In 1922, he said, what real incentive can there be under the principle of private control where the worker has no share in the profits and no voice in the shaping of conditions under which he works? He agreed that we had needed a lot of capital from people to get things started with the Industrial Revolution and transportation in the country. But now that that had been served, the worker needed to be as much a part of everything that happened after as the people who made the money from it. One of the things he also pointed out, we condemn the man who steals a loaf of bread while we pay honor to the man who steals $1 million. I don't think we've gotten past that either. And then one of the things I also really appreciated him is he pointed out how much public opposition there was to using taxpayer money for reform rather than for punishment. He said this opposition was from people who had never read a book on criminology, people who had never had direct dealing with prisoners. He said people tend to believe in irrational methods of protection when they're afraid. He said anthropology, biology, psychology, and sociology are furnishing us with volumes of information about the springs of human conduct. I believe an offender should be detained as long as he is a menace to public society, but he should be detained for only one reason, to restore him to physical, mental, and moral health. The last thing I'll say is he gave a talk called The Comprehensive View, and he quoted John Dewey, who said, "We are not only individuals, we are parts of a humanity that extends into the remote past and will continue into a remote future. More than anything else, the world needs this spirit today. No legislation, no new economic system, no changed industrial order will create this needed unity. The transfer of power from a self-seeking few to a self-seeking many will not help much unless this new spirit infuses and inspires men with a new consciousness of the spiritual unity that underlies all of our social life." So I love all these people way back when who were very progressive, and I wish we were a little farther along. They could be even more proud of us. So, so that's what I got.
Questions or comments that you, yes. Gosh, well, there's a mic that we should use. Becca, let me give you this. Here we go.
Well, I see from the pictures that they were renting the Schubert and other large places for him to speak. And then what about when radio came in? Did that mean they didn't have to have so many people and pay the rent for all those places?
You know that?
I think radio, I was looking, line 1922 was the station that became CCO. Actually, KUOM was the first one.
I don't recall the name of the station, but I know that he was on radio. And then again, there's this thing where we're packaging sermons and sending them out all over the Midwest. George, you got a question?
WCCO.
WCCO, huh? Okay. All right. Yes, Washburn Crosby Company. Other questions, thoughts? Polly.
We didn't actually get Dietrich's dates here.
Oh, 1916 to 1936.
Yes.
Say that in my
19, go ahead. 1916, he came here from Spokane. And then he was here till 36. Was that it?
Mhm.
So retired out to California. Clara Jullan, I know, died tragically in an accident in like 1927. She was still pretty young. I think a van driver or bus driver or something slipped on ice and hit her. So, yeah.
Ouch. Other thoughts? Questions? Yeah.
Yeah, this is probably something that hasn't been researched, certainly, but I'm just curious what kind of other organizations, progressive organizations that these people worked with, religious institutions, political organizations. I mean, it seemed like this First Unitarian was a real hub for progressive change and activism. And I'm just curious as to whether there were other similar organizations, again, religious or political or whatever, that they worked in tandem with, that they were like sort of like a local coalition.
Do you know more?
I would say that at those corn fests that the Stockwells hosted, lots of Unitarian Universalists or Unitarians came to those, but the socialists came, and a few people of color and communists came. My grandparents, who were members of this congregation, at least my grandmother was, she was a socialist. There was a Norwegian Unitarian church in town. It didn't last, and when it did fold, all of those Norwegian Unitarians came over and joined the FUS. There were other liberal organizations, I think, but I think the real lead, a lot of the center of things was here.
And yeah, there were a lot of social clubs, so-called social clubs. I know North Minneapolis had a lot more social clubs, and then they were kind of all disbanded and dispersed in the 50s and 60s, which means that North Minneapolis hasn't had a really great hub that was kind of designed. So, but social clubs were a big part of things as well. And it was partly conversations and dance and food. And then it just gave people a sense of camaraderie too.
Yeah. Yeah. Other thoughts, comments?
Yeah, thank you. So this FUS was founded in 1881, correct? And the state was founded in 1858. And First Universalist Church started in 1859. They were also very involved in lots of things in the state, like naming, along with the St. Paul Archdiocese, they named a bunch of streets in Minneapolis by the big shots in town. So when did this building get built?
Well, this particular building was in the 1950s. 51. Okay. They were downtown for a while. They had two other places, I believe.
Yeah, you got it.
Yep.
Thank you.
So when the street was widened at 8th and what is now 8th and it's called St. Mary's Place, but it was 8th and LaSalle. The streets were widened that they had to vacate that building. The 600 seats didn't take care of. There were crowds that came, 2,000 would come to hear Dietrich on a Sunday. So they had to rent several theaters downtown. Lyceum was just one. We just showed you a picture of the Allen. But they had a little office building on Loring Park. It was the former women's club on Loring Park. You know where the statue of Ole Bull is? It was about there. And it had a ballroom, and the kids, there was a small RE program. John Dietrich didn't believe that kids really needed RE. He said, raise them as Lutherans and they'll be angry enough to become Unitarians. So we had that little building on Loring Park, which was terribly inadequate until we built this building. Our cornerstone, you can see in the Dietrich room. You also see a painting of Dietrich in there. But our cornerstone is from the first building, the 1880. I think it was actually, the building was completed in 1887. But that's from the first building. And it was pulled up here in 1951, and this building opened for us in 1951. It was smaller. We had to build the bottom floors later, but I don't know how many of you were here in the 50s. And see, Catherine Jordan remembers when it was a smaller building. Yeah. But yeah, we're late. And it's true, Rick, there were Universalists, and they started Unity Settlement House, and women from this congregation did help at Unity Settlement House too. Yeah.
I'll also just make a note that when Clara Jullan died, even though they had left the Unitarian Society, she still had a lot of her friends here, and the service was done by the Unity minister in St. Paul. So they didn't have it at the Plymouth Congregational or anything. They did it independent.
Thank you. I just want to mention I have a small connection to John Dietrich. John came from the Reformed Church of America, which is a Dutch-based church, which I happen to have grown up in myself. So I have a little tiny connection to John Dietrich.
Yeah, I think he started in Pittsburgh, and then he got in trouble there for something. Yeah, and then he went to Spokane, and then yeah, they really wooed him here. So
Yeah, quite the guy. Catherine? We have to get out of here for Tim's sake. Oh, here we go.
So one of my early memories is Brenda Jullan sitting over here in a pew. And I wished that I had talked to her, and I was too young to really take advantage of that. But she was a very important presence. I don't know that she was late in life at that point, but just nice to see that whole circle of the Jullans. And we used to go to, the Jullans they lived on now what is Bede-Makaska, but they had a series of houses right on the corner there across kitty corner from the archery area. And there was a Sunday in the spring, and the whole congregation went out to the Jullans for a picnic. So we did that.
And in her autobiography, which is entitled Me, she describes skinny dipping in Lake of the Isles and Bede-Makaska. Becca, here you are.
So when did they get the first woman on the board or trustees of FUS?
That was Maud Stockwell, and that was 1912. So we were ahead of the game, I'd say.
I'm just sharing a comment from Carol, who's online with us, saying that in 1987, she had had conversations with a member who shared her remembrance of Simmons when she was a child, that Simmons used to come to her home for Sunday dinner. So I don't know who that was, Carol. You don't know who that was either. But anyway.
yeah, he did go to the Jullans. They had a big family, so they had a big ride out to their house.
Yeah. Other thoughts? Other thoughts? Are we up, George? There's two Georges. Okay, this George first.
One other brief connection that in my history, when we first moved to Minneapolis, we just graduated college, and I was interested in becoming an architect, and got a entry-level job running prints and making coffee at a firm downtown, which was Thorson and Thorshaw Associates. And Roy Thorshaw is the architect of this building. And I had no idea at the time what was going on. He was also the president of the Torska Klubben, which was a fraternal organization of Norwegians. And they would meet, and they actually had a building on, I believe it was Lake Street, that he later designed. Right. Yes. And
Sons of Norway.
Sons of Norway. And so I would be back in the mailroom, stamping these monthly letters that would go out from the office to members of Torska Klubben, inviting them to a lutefisk dinner and meeting at the club. So, but Roy was very elderly at that time, and but very jolly. And of course, I had no idea what the connection was until much later when we joined here. So.
Yeah. Okay. Then we should pull it together, I think, pretty quick.
Just wanted to point out, if people are interested in reading some of John Dietrich's the addresses, Mickey and I have been over all of them, and there is some really interesting reading there, and they're pretty short, so it's kind of fun. You have your coffee and read these, but there are addresses on many of them are biographies of influential people. There are a lot of things about certain issues, and I know you share, and I know, Wendy, you've read them too. Sometimes you feel that none of these issues ever get solved because they're just the same today as they were then. But and then there's a whole series on it's called The Fathers of Evolution, and Dietrich was big on evolution, and those addresses formed a book. But it's really interesting if you've read about evolution before. A lot of information you might not have had. Anyway, it's on the FUS Archives website. It's you can link to it from the regular FUS website, and we have just about everything that we could find that he wrote, and we even have some new stuff that may get worked on soon. So.
And Meadville Lombard is supposed to have a good database of it because we created a database with search words and things. I did ask recently because I can't find it on their website, but yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So Rick wants to speak and Rev Jullan would like to speak. And then guys, we have to wrap it up because this
There's a
wonderful sanctuary is going to be used for memorial service.
Yep.
Here you go.
This is a question from Fred online. He says the farmer labor party movement was active in roughly the same years as Dietrich's time at FUS. I would guess there was overlap in involvement, ?
Oh boy, lots and lots. And we are the DFL in Minnesota as opposed to the Democrats because of the incredible unrest and the issues like suffrage, issues like labor oppression and labor safety, because they were so big here in Minnesota and people were so outspoken. That's why we are the DFL. We had to forge under Humphrey, we had to forge the interests of the farmers together with the interests of labor in the city. It took decades to do it, but that's why we're the DFL in Minnesota as opposed to the Democrats. Rick, did you want to add? Okay, one. All right.
I would love to see this congregation grow. And something I learned here at one of the assemblies was there's a thing called beliefnet.com. And I did the survey and I went through and answered all the questions. And I found out it said humanism, humanist would be my kind of congregation. And I'd like to mention that on the exchange that we have, but I heard today that maybe there's only 100 people here that are on the exchange, which is kind of an email communication thing. Can that be announced at one of our assemblies? So everybody knows that that's an opportunity for us to get connected through the emailing kind of thing.
Thanks for the 100, but it's not. Okay. Thank you all for being here. Thanks for your inquisitive minds, which is what keeps us a lively society. And thanks for your comments, and you're great. Have a beautiful Sunday.